You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. And now for a brand new show we hope you'll like. Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 59, Episode at the Bar M. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Ashley Thomas.
Each week on Gene-ology, we take a wild ride through the Roddenberry archives, examining Gene Roddenberry's early work for signs of the morals, meanings, and messages that he was fond of including in his most famous later work, Star Trek.
This week, new year, new you, new series, as we begin our journey through Wrangler, Gene's first series to make it past the pilot stage. Now, before we get to trivia on this week's episode, let me take a brief moment to encourage you to please join our Patreon, or follow us on YouTube, or leave a review wherever you're listening to us, or all of the above. And now, this week's trivia. Earl, I hope you're ready to rope our listeners in with some good trivia.
I tried to wrangle as much trivia as I could, and let me say at the outset that I had a huge research assist from our own John Champion on this. Looking up newspaper clippings in the Los Angeles Times and finding several about this show. So, kind of a big deal. And again, questions about how this show sort of dropped out of the history books. Episode at the Bar M is the pilot episode of Wrangler, but incidentally, if you listen to podcast number 58, where our own John Champion and Eugene Roddenberry shared their experiences watching the Wrangler episodes archived at the UCLA library, you'll remember that this episode was not available to view. The library's online search does list it, so it could be that that listing is in error, or it exists and simply couldn't be located for their screening. In either case, we're lucky enough to have two drafts of the script, an untitled pilot draft dated October 30th, 1959, and a final revised script draft dated May 16th, 1960. The initial draft is in a somewhat fancier folder, whose cover simply reads, Wrangler by Gene Roddenberry. The inside cover page repeats the Wrangler title, and in the bottom right-hand corner, television series created by Gene Roddenberry, pilot script, with television series in all caps. Most of Gene's scripts that we've seen are presented like any other script with a simple cover sheet. This was just a bit fancier, so it's obvious that Gene or somebody knew this was kind of a big deal for his career. Episode at the Bar M kicked off Wrangler's short run on Thursday, August 4th, 1960, on NBC, where it was the summer replacement for The Ford Show, a weekly variety show that was sponsored by Ford Motors and hosted by Tennessee Ernie Ford. It wasn't ever intended to be a permanent replacement for that show, but was simply scheduled to give that show's cast and crew members some time off. When Wrangler went off the air, the Ford Show simply resumed its time slot. But it would seem that Wrangler's run was supposed to begin earlier. According to a review that appeared in the Los Angeles Times TV scene column on the day of the show's premiere, Wrangler was originally intended to premiere a month earlier. Our own John Champion did some further digging and found another preview article in the July 3rd edition of the LA Times, indicating that the show would premiere the following Thursday, which would have been July 7th. For technical reasons, that did not happen on time. At least on the West Coast, Wrangler naturally occupied the Ford Show's 9:30 p.m. time slot, and the LA Times review also notes that Wrangler was, unusually for a Western, shot on videotape with the Marconi Mark IV camera, with most scenes being shot simultaneously from 3 angles, and the director would be sitting in a control room, switching the show like live television. Blocking and movements were carefully rehearsed in advance, and retakes were not unheard of. The July 3rd article included a quote from the star of Wrangler, Jason Evers. Pitcairn seems genuine to me, live. He's the real American cowboy in the style of the Virginian, and he's a lot of man. He's a humorist, philosopher, a hunter, a book reader. Gene Roddenberry did a beautiful job of writing him. The August 4th preview written by Cecil Smith also singles Gene out, saying, "The show sounds pretty routine, but it was written by Gene Roddenberry, which may well take it out of the routine sagebrush class." So, were the reviews this glowing after the show aired? Stay tuned for the answer to that question. Since he spoke so highly of Gene, let's check in with the star of Wrangler, Jason Evers. Born in New York, he got his start on Broadway before migrating to Tinseltown. Wrangler was his first role as a series regular. He had been plying his trade as a guest star since arriving in L.A. in the late 40s, putting in guest appearances on The Phil Silvers Show, Studio One, and Deadline. He was much more familiar as the star of The Brain That Wouldn't Die. Yes, that movie you saw on Mystery Science Theater 3000 with Jan and the Pan, which filmed before Wrangler but wasn't released until 1962. At about the same time Gene was doing The Lieutenant, Jason Evers was starting as a college professor in a series called Channing, where a very young William Shatner played a student in one episode. Jason then turned up as a guest star in the third season of Star Trek as Rael in Wink of an Eye. Guest starring as Helen McQueen is an actress who would later leave a powerful impression on the pilot for another series created by Gene. Welcome Susan Oliver to the Roddenberry Repertory Players, already known for guest roles on such shows as Father Knows Best, Bonanza, and The Twilight Zone. Star Trek fans, of course, know Susan best as Vina from The Cage, and she was a frequent TV guest star through the end of the 80s, but also became a director in her own right, as well as a licensed aircraft pilot. There's an entire documentary devoted to her life and career. Check out The Green Girl if you want to know more. Sadly, we lost Susan to lung cancer in 1990. And Denver Pyle is back. Probably still best known as Uncle Jesse from the Dukes of Hazzard, Denver was a mainstay of the TV Western scene, and his Wrangler guest role came less than a year after he guest starred as McKay in one of Gene's episodes of Have Gun Will Travel, The Posse, which we covered back in episode 43 of this very podcast. And we'll see Denver Pyle again in a more modern-day role when we cover an episode of The Lieutenant, The War Called Peace. Another future lieutenant guest star is also on hand here, John Milford, who will go on to play a recurring guest role in the next series created by Gene. The role of Andy is played by Jack Ging, who we haven't seen before, but he was a familiar face on TV in this era, with roles on Highway Patrol, Men into Space, The Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and Perry Mason. He would go on to be the star of a much longer-running series, The 11th Hour, created by the other most prolific writer of Have Gun Will Travel episodes, Harry Julian Fink. One last note, while IMDb calls this episode Incident at the Bar M, the cover sheet of Gene's script clearly identifies it as Episode at the Bar M. But it is an episode that chronicles an incident, so why not both?
You telling me how to run this spread?
You telling me you ain't flank deep in trouble? They say in Denver you're bucking the cattle buyers.
And you rid clear up to Wyoming just to help out.
If the price is right.
How do I know Denver ain't already met your price?
I'd say their man is already here. The one who salted your water holes, wired the trail last month, busted your foreman's leg.
We'll get another range boss.
Out of your bunkhouse? Your good men have already been scared off. You've had to fill in with saddle tramps, anything you can get.
You suggesting we'd put a total stranger in charge?
I figure the thought's been running through your mind. Just takes a while to get used to it. The name's Pitcairn.
Goodbye, Mr. Pitcairn. Shortest way out of south.
Pitcairn is an American cowboy who rides the 1880s western frontier, helping people in need. With a carbine in his saddle boot, Pitcairn and his horse, Sam, look for work and adventure in the Wild West. Act 1. Pitcairn rides along the Arroyo Trail at the end of a long day. When he rounds the bend in the trail, he finds a pool. But it's not just any pool. It's a bathing pool. And what's more, it's got a bather in it. A young woman in her mid-20s, Helen McQueen, is washing up in the bathing pool, shielded by some strategically placed shrubbery. Pitcairn takes notice and declares, "I do declare," to himself. Helen takes notice of Pitcairn and hollers at him to get out. But Pitcairn is having too much fun to take heed. He takes to conversing with his horse Sam, commenting on the unusual foliage of the countryside, i.e. Helen's clothes lying on the shrubbery. Helen shouts at him again, "This is Bar M land, closed range." Pitcairn pays her no mind and approaches the water's edge, washing the trail dust off his face and neck and helping himself to a cool drink. Helen is infuriated and starts making her way to the other side of the pool, reaching for her gun. She warns Pitcairn to back up or she'll shoot. He's still talking to his horse, though, mumbling about a Chinook wind and how it'll be a blizzard here in a month. Helen is a volcano of rage and begins a countdown, warning Pitcairn that gunfire will erupt at the end of the countdown if he does not get gone. Helen reaches for the gun, but Pitcairn remarks that the sight of her might be worth dying for. She pauses, her bluff called. But Pitcairn stands and moves towards Sam the horse, saying, "Maybe not, though. She'd probably turn out round and fat as a pumpkin." "Well, that's enough of that. Shows how all-fired smart you are. I weigh—" She starts, but then shouts, "You just ride down and ask for a job at the Bar M, mister. They'll make you wish I had shot you." Pitcairn considers this information and then rides off. Act 2. Back at the Bar M, Pitcairn rides towards the bunkhouse where Andy, a young 20-something blonde man, and an older, harder, meaner-looking 40-something man, Link, are sitting. They look towards Pitcairn as he approaches, and Link hollers inside the bunkhouse that there's a rider coming in. Ritter joins Link and Andy on the bunkhouse porch. Ritter is a big, broad, good-looking man, and has the look of a man who has seldom lost a fight. He moves to block Pitcairn's approach. Pitcairn straightens himself up and pulls a small black book from his saddle roll. Ritter shouts at him to get back, but Pitcairn shows him the book and asks, "How long has it been since you've looked in this book?" "Oh, it's been a while, I can see. You've been lusting after dice and red wine and—" "Now, wait, I thought you were, what, just a stranger? A lonely Samaritan to be turned away? What was the last of that Sunday so long ago? Now, listen, if you're a circuit rider—" "Am I a circuit rider? Everybody step up. I want everyone to hear this." Link and Andy want no part of this and excuse themselves to feed the chickens. Pitcairn then invites Ritter to bow his head with him, but Ritter offers to curry his horse instead. Pitcairn makes for the house where he meets Pete, who is seated behind a heavy table. Pete is a big, strong man in his 50s wearing a buckskin jacket. Pete addresses him angrily, saying that the men had orders to send strangers away. How did he get in? Pitcairn addresses him in equal measure. The facade of the even-tempered parson has been put aside. "I asked if you needed a Wrangler. Not that there's too much doubt about it, based on what I've seen." The men go back and forth, and Pitcairn calls Pete's bluff. Pitcairn tells him what he heard back in Denver. Somebody's trying to mess with the Bar M. Someone has salted the water holes, wired the trail last month, and busted the foreman's leg. It's bad news. Pete shrugs him off and says they'll hire a new range boss. Pitcairn calls him on that as well. The bunkhouse isn't full of good men anymore. All the good ones got scared off. Pete can't put a total stranger in charge. Or can he? Pitcairn offers his hand to shake, but Pete ignores it and goes back to his figures, telling Pitcairn not to let the door hit him where the good Lord split him. But Pitcairn isn't moving. He shows Pete the little black book he's carrying, Virgil's Aeneid. He reads, "The sound of hooves fills the crumbling plain. Meanwhile, time is flying, flying, never to return." To quote the great philosopher Ned Stark, "Winter is coming, Pete. You've got less than a month before the first freeze and over 2,000 head of cattle to get in." Just then, Helen McQueen enters the front door, fresh from her bath in the pool. Her eyes fall on Pitcairn, and she tells Pete that he needs to get Pitcairn out of here. Post haste. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. But that's no way to treat your possible range boss, ma'am. If Helen were on fire, she couldn't be more furious. Get Ritter in here, Pete. I need this man thrown out. But Ritter's currying my horse right now. Helen refuses to believe such obvious malarkey, and yet it's true. Nice, polite boy, says Pitcairn. Helen declares to Pete that she's putting Ritter in charge. Pete, now angry himself, informs Helen that just because she's sweet on him doesn't mean he's qualified to be a foreman. Pitcairn, amused by this exchange, looks over to Pete. Is she running the place, McQueen? At the question, Pete stands and moves from behind the table with the assistance of a cane. Pete's the foreman whose leg got tore up. He's not McQueen. She is. Well, now aren't you just full of surprises? Helen says she'd almost let Pitcairn have the job just to watch the other men mess him up. Pitcairn says if they don't, he'll take a cent a pound on every steer he brings in. Sound fair, McQueen? That's Miss McQueen to you. You talking as a woman or a rancher? You can't lean on both. Helen is the embodiment of the hell in a woman scorned quote from Mark Twain at this remark. She gives Pitcairn a try, and he'll get everything that's come to him. And she storms away. Pitcairn waits until she's not quite out of earshot and says, Pretty girl. Little plump for my taste, though. Helen very nearly turns, but restrains herself and exits. What was that for? Asked Pete. Well, a wandering man does crave attention, I guess. Pete sends him to the bunkhouse for all the attention he can handle. Act 3. The men of the Bar M are chatting in the bunkhouse about the new range boss. Andy thinks it's clever that he made them think he was a parson. Duke tells Ritter he'll ace you out of your girl. Link drives the stake in further. Yeah, look how he had you combing and currying his horse. Some of the men laugh at this, but Ritter goes back to his shaving. Ritter vows to give Pitcairn's hide some attention, too. Now's his chance. Pitcairn's making his way toward the bunkhouse. He enters with all eyes upon him, except for Ritter, who's still shaving. He introduces himself as the new range boss, but is only met with silence until Andy starts to welcome him. That is until the other men throw massive shade in his general direction. Pitcairn walks to an empty bunk and asks if it's occupied. Link informs him that it's as empty as Pitcairn's skull. He goes to hang up his gear, including his carbine rifle, but Duke gets up and throws it to the floor. That's his nail. One of the other men, with the auspicious name of Sandwich, says he'd like to borrow that gun. He's eager to do some rabbit hunting. Pitcairn agrees and tells him to keep it all week. He continues to unpack while Link grabs Pitcairn's cologne, Florida water. Well, that sure smells nice as he dabs himself generously and tosses it to Andy. Then the men pass the bottle and take a little dab or two. Pitcairn picks up a small can and offers the men his genuine Boston boot polish, too. Give it a try. He tosses it to one of the men. The crew are stumped at his refusal to be baited. And Andy finally speaks up. You know you're going to have to fight, right? Pitcairn says he never throws the first punch. He always waits until someone tries him. Ritter says he'll do that for him right now. But Pitcairn is prepared and produces a knife from his bedroll, slashing Ritter's shirt right across the breadbasket. But only his shirt. The skin underneath is untouched. Pitcairn then informs the men that he's got a needle and thread, too, if any of them want to borrow it. Pitcairn starts to put the knife away, but Ritter's a glutton for punishment. This time his weapon of choice isn't a knife. It's a sock filled with something heavy, and like the proverbial Goliath, Ritter hits the floor when the sock connects with his head. Pitcairn then empties out several bars of soap from the sock and lets the men know that he's got plenty to share. He then grabs Link and asks him his name. Then informs him he's on Nighthawk. Get going. Pitcairn releases him and Link gets out the door, but Sandwich, who might be a few sandwiches short of a picnic himself, moves angrily toward Pitcairn. Pitcairn delivers the slap heard round the world and sends Sandwich sprawling to his bunk. Sandwich reaches for his gun, aims it at Pitcairn's belly, and fires. Click! In the words of the great philosopher Elmer Fudd, uh-oh, no more bullets. Pitcairn grabs the barrel and tells him to put the gun back where he got it, and Sandwich obliges. One of the men quietly returns the shoe polish and Florida water. Pitcairn then informs the men that he knows some cattle buyer's man is bunking with them. If he catches him, he'll be treated like a horse thief. If anyone wants out, now's the time to say so. Silence. He then goes over their hours and compensation. He'll be handing down the orders, assigning the jobs, and will handle the complaints. If you want out, speak now or forever hold your peace. Silence. Benefits include good chuck, prompt pay, and medical, a.k.a. if you get a blister, Pitcairn himself will apply the iodine. Questions? Silence. Well, don't let me keep you. There's work to be done. Our crew is busy about the task of herding the cattle, watching for strays, and then Pitcairn observes some cattle that are too young to drive south. They need to be branded. Duke and Sandwich set to the task of roping and branding the calves. Meanwhile, Pitcairn speaks to Helen, who's watching, dressed in range apparel. Pitcairn notes that they'll need winter feed for all the late calves. Helen ignores him as Ritter rides up. She tells him to draw the herd in tighter. There are too many strays. But Pitcairn says no. They're already tired and spooked. That'll cause a stampede. Ritter awaits Helen's command, but she angrily concedes. Ritter rides off, mad as hell, and Pitcairn points out that Ritter feels jealous, makes him mean-tempered. Helen won't hear it and walks away as Pitcairn says to no one he's doing better and would make a good foreman, eventually. That night, everyone's seated around the campfire. Pitcairn's got a tin of coffee, which he offers to Link, who's just ridden up. He's beat, tired, swaying in the saddle. Link pounds the coffee offered him and says he's about to fall out. But Pitcairn says that Duke bet he'd be given up about now. Link won't hear of it and takes the herd toward the south slopes. The winter grass is breaking through there. Can't let Duke be right. He rides off. Would you believe the same trick worked on Duke? Duke swears he could outpunch Link on a jackass. He rides off with a couple of hands to outdo his coworker. Pitcairn is quite pleased with himself until a bullet ricochets off the ground next to him. He grabs his gun and goes for a dive to cover in the same move. Crouching low, he moves towards his assailant in the dark. Just then, Ritter rides up, but it's not Pitcairn he sees. Andy rides through the brush. Ritter thought Andy was with the herd, but Andy says he was just following a stray. Must have spotted the same one, huh? They go off in opposite directions. But who fired the shot? The next day, we find Pitcairn working through the herd looking for a certain bull and begins pursuit. Ritter, Andy, and Sandwich join him to round up the bull. Pitcairn tells Ritter he's looking tired from being in the saddle all night. He should rest up. No way, says Ritter. I can keep up with you. Pitcairn compliments him on his work and says if he could learn to manage his temper, he could be the boss next year. Ritter informs him that he doesn't need his help. Pitcairn just says, you and the lady are a lot alike. Good, healthy young animals. Just need a little breaking. Ritter promises him that someone's getting broken when they're done and heads off towards his horse. Pitcairn rides up to see Helen by the campfire, looking troubled. He informs her of the fair breeding stock out there, man and animal. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Just who are you anyway, Pitcairn? She asks as she pours them both a cup of coffee, still looking troubled. Who is anybody, he says. Helen doesn't like that answer. You talk like an ignorant waddy half the time and use two-bit words other times. You push them in until they ought to hate you, and they don't. Except for Ritter, of course. You must want something special. Pitcairn says he just wants to count every square mile this side of the Mississippi. Helen still looks worried and comments that he's pulled the herd awfully tight. Pitcairn says it's a necessity. The trail crew picks him up in the morning. Nobody better cough loud tonight. He takes a closer look at her and moves in, sincerely. Rear back and fight. Buck anyone that tries to break you, he says. But when a man earns it, trust him. Helen finally shares her trouble. 10 sticks of blasting powder were missing from the supply house this morning. Not good. At camp later that day, the crew rides in hot and weary. They make for the food, but stop at the water bag to wash up. The men are tired, but proud of the work they've done. Link grins at Pitcairn as he lights a cigarette on the branding iron. We showed you a thing or two, huh? And vice versa, says Pitcairn. Which man you want on Nighthawk? Andy asks. Pitcairn isn't sure. Ritter rides in and says, just one thing left to finish, huh? Pitcairn tries to ignore him and reaches for his coffee, which Ritter promptly kicks away. You'll be paid off and gone in the morning, Ritter says. Pitcairn sets his plate aside and gets up. Look, I'm just asking you to... But Pitcairn receives a fist to the face. Pitcairn scrambles and grabs a branding iron, holding the hot end out, fending off Ritter. 1 hour, Ritter. Just wait. What follows is a fencing match with branding irons as Ritter grabs another from the fire. Andy starts to move away from the scene, saying to do that, he better get the herd. But, Andy, what's that in your jacket? Are you actually just 3 owls in a cowpuncher attire? Pitcairn notices Andy and shouts that no one leaves. Pitcairn tries to sway Ritter with reason. There's blasting power missing. To stampede the... But Ritter cuts him off. It's as good a story as any. Hold it! Pitcairn shouts to Andy. Pitcairn tries to run off towards Andy, but Ritter tackles him. Trying to get away, Pitcairn brands Ritter's hand, getting away from Ritter, but not from Andy. Pitcairn swings the iron and lets it fly. It hits the horse's flank, throwing the rider to the ground. The men, realizing what's happening as the blasting powder falls to the ground, go to assist Pitcairn, bringing Andy to heel. Pitcairn apologizes to Ritter about the hand. Ritter apologizes for starting the fight. Pitcairn tells him to get back to the house and have Miss Helen put some pork fat on it, but Ritter doesn't want her to see it. Pitcairn replies, one thing women and ranchers got in common, cowboy. They like a mark on their property. The next day, Pitcairn is back at the Arroyo pool. He kneels to wash and drink when he hears a voice. Helen. Pitcairn says, what's that, Sam? Helen says, before I give Ritter an answer, I'd like to say goodbye to you. Is that wrong? Pitcairn turns, looks off to the side, and says to his horse, do me a favor, Sam. Get lost. Pitcairn mounts and moves purposefully in the other direction. The end.
Excellent job with the recap, Ashley. I don't know if Pitcairn's staying around, but you definitely understood the assignment. You get the job.
Well, thank you, my friend. I don't know that I want the job, but again, it sounds hot and dusty and dirty, and I like cows well enough, but I don't relish the idea of branding them. That makes me sad.
Yeah, lot going on there, and
yeah,
let's start with that opening scene.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying not to overthink this. I'm trying not to overlay too many of my 21st century sensibilities on this. It does read as just a bit creepy, though.
Yeah, a smidge on the creepy side. Not ideal.
I think where I do come really close to letting it off the hook is it gets across the idea that Pitcairn is less interested in Helen than he is in the water.
Yeah.
The whole thing about completely ignoring her and then getting a little bit pervy on her when she threatens to get out of the water and arm herself, that hasn't aged particularly well.
Yeah.
But at the very least, he's all talk. He's not imposing any physicality on her. He is doing all his perving from over there with Sam the horse. And, he is not threatening her in any way, but still just leave the lady alone.
Like, come on, bud. She said go away. And you said, I do declare.
Maybe this is just me. If I spotted someone's clothes adorning the tree next to a watering hole, I would think that would be my signal to find another watering hole, maybe?
Yeah. Unless I'm, going to die, then, we're taking the next exit, Sam.
Yeah, and I'm sure Sam was good for it. Okay.
Yeah.
I will admit that my experience with the film Western is a bit limited. Probably have more TV Western experience. So I had to look up Waddy because I haven't run into that before.
I'm not familiar with that term either.
So what I found is that it has been somewhat defanged now, but at the time in the 1880s, this would have been an insult describing a cattle rustler or someone who is assumed to be up to no good. Like, they might be trying to show up and be your wrench hand, but they are probably doing that for another purpose. They are probably doing that for their own ends and not to help you and not just for work. Now, over time, apparently the derogatory connotation has become less severe, and now it's just a synonym for any cowboy. But at the time, it was a bit of an insult.
Earl, I've got a real problem with Pitcairn body shaming this woman that he has never met before, and he's already, like, creeping on while she's trying to take a bath. No.
I want to give Pete some points for calling Pitcairn out on the plump comment.
Yeah. Why'd you do that for?
Yeah, I don't think guys call out other guys on this kind of crap often enough, then or now.
Yeah.
I get a little bit sick of the bro code myself, so
yeah.
I was very pleased that we at least have Pete saying, you know, why did you say that?
Yeah.
Here's another kind of blatantly sexist thing that jumped out at me. Woman or rancher? You can't lean on both.
Oh, yes. I had that one in all caps. The heck? WTF, Gene?
Why the hell can't she? What does it matter?
She's certainly doing it right now.
Yeah, it seems to me like she is both. So, you know, if you're trying to keep your job, you know, if you're trying to get the job and keep the job, maybe don't be flinging stuff like that out there. Now, perhaps Gene is just trying to portray the mentality of the times. As the Beach Boys said, I was not made for those times.
Nope. I was not either, because so many people would have earfuls.
Or black eyes. This whole thing, like, you know, McQueen, this how you're running your place? It's like, she's McQueen. She's McQueen?
Oh.
And that brings me to kind of the biggie here, which is, and I think we'll have a lot more to say about this in discussion. Am I the only one having Maggie O'Banion flashbacks?
I was definitely having Maggie O'Banion flashbacks, my friend. I think Paladin's a lot more polite than Pitcairn.
Yeah, and I hope we get to a point with this show where maybe we find out what the point of that is. But in the meantime, the whole fight scene in the bunk room, where they're talking about Pitcairn's fancy Florida water.
Florida water? Who thought that was a good idea for cologne? Is that a real cologne?
I have no idea, but that whole
I'm Googling
scene,
that right now.
The whole time I was reading that in the script, in the back of my head, I was hearing, New York City, get the ropes.
Oh my gosh, Florida water is a real cologne. The original formula since 1808, a light floral scent with lemon overtones. Florida water cools, cleanses, and calms.
If I use Florida water, will I become Florida man?
That is a wonderful, wonderful question, my friend. The thought crossed my mind. You were talking about New York City. Florida water was introduced in New York City and sold in corner pharmacies as an everyday staple. My thought with, like, Florida water, like, I guess it's, like, not necessarily a cologne. Maybe it's, like, face wash or something like that. Or maybe, no, that definitely says cologne. I don't know. So, anyway, sorry about my Florida water rant. You may now continue with Gene-ology already in progress.
We had to know.
Oh, gosh. Anyway.
There was one thing that caused my inner English major to twitch uncontrollably. A line of dialogue that was written exactly like this. Must have spotted the same stray. Toward the end of the story, I thought I saw a stray. Oh, well, I must have spotted the same stray. It's written out, must have.
Oh my gosh, I totally skimmed over that. My brain didn't even process it.
And I was like, oh, no.
Oh, no.
This is an English 101 mistake, but maybe, I will admit that I have read some of the later Wrangler scripts, And there are sort of similar things where I think Gene is dropping these in the script to give you an idea of the level of education that certain characters have. Mm-hmm. At least I am choosing to believe that rather than that Gene Roddenberry would be making a first-year English blooper like that and leaving it there in print for us to discover, 65 years later.
Right. Or perhaps it's written that way to be read for inflection, must of versus must have.
Could
or must have.
Yeah, almost like a phonetic thing.
Yeah.
There is a narrator in the pilot version of the script or episode or incident at the Bar M, where this narrator just talks nonstop about Pitcairn setting up the story. And all of this is said as the camera explores a museum-like exhibit devoted to Pitcairn's adventures and the memorabilia thereof, eventually settling on a painting and a bronze bust of Pitcairn, all while the narrator says the following: "This is the Pitcairn Library, and this is Pitcairn, a wandering man, hunter, humorist, wrangler. They said he could ride a hole in the wind. There wasn't much about cattle, water, and men he couldn't handle, or at least give a try. Every item authentic, a true story from the real West, 1,000,000 square miles of turbulence, tragedy, humor, and drama, such as no country ever has before, and none is likely to see again. Take these branding irons. They've glowed cherry red 1,000 times, hot enough to put a mark on a man's property or on another man." And then there's a whole interaction with one of the ranch hands at a saloon who points him toward the Bar M. And the next scene is pretty much the same as the first scene in the final script. And what that tells you is that whole wordy intro was superfluous and also kind of pricey because, setting up a museum exhibit and the script specified that this exhibit had wings, it's going to cost you something to build all that. And also, if you have a painting of your character and you have a bronze bust of your character, it's going to cost money to create those things. You're going to have to pay somebody to create those. So I feel like someone somewhere, fortunately, told Gene, okay, we could cut this whole thing off the front and lose nothing. I'm actually surprised at how little difference there is between the pilot script and the final revision. Much of it is word for word the same.
These are the voyages?
Yeah, if it took you a lot longer to say these are the voyages. I understand the purpose of the narration in Star Trek, but it's also over within 45 seconds.
Oh, no, I was talking about the finale to Enterprise that everyone rightly hates. That was called These Are the Voyages, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, so you say you could lop that off and lose nothing?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
well, no, like the whole idea of this is a museum, and then we're talking about the Great Pitcairn or whatever, and it just kind of gave me that same kind of vibe. Riker's like, oh yeah, this history, and then this really terrible thing, which I'm not going to say for anybody who's not seeing Enterprise, but a really terrible thing happens in the finale for Enterprise, so just skip it. I will never tell anyone to ever skip an episode of Star Trek ever, but skip it. Anyway, that's the kind of vibe I got from that. Like, this is actually a history lesson or whatever, and we're experiencing history through the eyes of Pitcairn. Is he a that type of character? No. Maybe a little, but no.
Yeah, and the whole thing about this is a true story from the real West, that reminds me of all these disclaimers from Highway Patrol about, this show is authentically produced. Well, yes, that is a true statement. Someone did produce the show. Thank you.
No GMO.
Yeah. No actors were harmed in the making of this show.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's not a crime for a writer to want to retell a story if they feel they can do it better. If they feel like they didn't hit the mark the first time, Gene would not be the only writer who's ever done that. And, this goes back to literature, decades and centuries before television. So it's kind of a time-honored tradition. But again, it feels like we're kind of using the basic outline of Maggie O'Banion from Have Gun Will Travel, and the changes made here are not improvements. Helen gets even less to do and less to say than Maggie did. We are having Susan Oliver do this role. Pitcairn is more perfect than Paladin in just about every way, and it strips any and all tension out of the story. To some extent, you know that if someone's the star of the show, they're probably going to survive the day, at least in this era of television. In the 60s, it was very uncommon to knock off a main character. So there really wasn't that much tension. It was just like, of course he's going to get out of this one. The only remaining tension lies in figuring out how. Knowing that Paladin could get mugged or concussed or what have you, that doesn't diminish Paladin. It raises the stakes. It keeps us on the edge of our seats. Pitcairn never really seems like he's in a huge amount of danger here, and I thought the story suffered for it.
Yeah, he's always got like one leg up on everybody else here. And just magically. I mean, but the only time we see him falter at all is when Ritter gets to land a punch on him.
Yeah, I almost cheered. I was like, oh, finally.
Yeah. He's not perfect. He didn't see that one coming. Cool.
I can almost see that scored with comedy music, though, because it, again, very little of consequence happening with regards to Pitcairn. And I found myself missing Paladin.
Yeah. Would agree with that. It's definitely, he's got like some Paladin type swagger. Paladin is self-assured. Pitcairn is arrogant.
I look forward to exploring further scripts from this show to see if we get a better, more rounded view of this character, because going from the pilot alone, and again, we don't have the shows to watch. The shows that do exist, we haven't seen. So we're going from words on a page. I just hope the show was better than this, but we'll get back to that before we're done with the podcast. What did you find here, Ashley?
For me, the biggest thing here is I'm so frustrated with the treatment of Helen, who owns the freaking ranch. And he's like, I don't understand this woman hiring him anyway. Because if I'm taking a bath and some dude like creeps on me while I'm trying to take a bath, I am not having anything to do with him. He can get out, because I'm not giving him a job. Especially not at a place I own. Go away. You're gross. So I found that really frustrating. And I found it really frustrating that like her anger is played for laughs. I don't know how tall Susan Oliver was, but she's adorable. And when cute women get angry, especially if they are short, she's 5'5", so she's 2 inches taller than me. When cute women get angry and we're short, everybody's like, oh, that's adorable. It's like a mad kitten. Mad kitten is kind of adorable. And the kitten gets madder because you're not taking them seriously. I felt like that was what was happening here.
It's not a good look. And I know that I kind of front-loaded some of my concerns and objections into observations. And may have stolen my own thunder for this segment. But again, it's such a late 50s trope that even when we are acknowledging that there is a woman in charge, the male character has to, establish dominance? Yeah.
Are you talking as a woman or as a ranch hand? You can't lean on both.
Seems to me like if she has the money to do both, she can do whatever she damn well pleases.
Yeah. I just found all of that so frustrating because we know Gene is a better writer of women than this. And he tends to treat his women better than this for the most part in these Western things, but this is like Maggie O'Banion, but let's make it worse. Worse by an order of 10.
The frustrating thing there is that we can't blame a story editor or a producer for this. Gene is the producer on this show.
Yeah.
This is his show. This is his creation. There was an executive producer, although I kind of get the impression from the context in which I saw that there was an executive producer, that person was there mainly to keep the show on the rails from a technical standpoint, because they were doing something new here, shooting a Western on video rather than film. So this person was probably not calling the shots with story. That's all Gene. And hey, you want to be the producer so no one changes your words. Great. But as the producer, the buck stops with you. And so now we are at a point where we're seeing this stuff and there really is no nuancing it with, a story editor may have changed this, a producer may have changed it. He is the producer. This is his thing.
I don't know how much other studio because I don't know how these things work. I don't know how much other studio interference there might have been with that, but.
And this is the pilot script. This sold the show.
I think, could we call him a Gary Stu? Could we call him Gary Stu?
I kind of, that phrase was kind of floating around the back of my head with Pitcairn being just too good at everything. What a guy.
What a guy. More than Paladin.
Yeah.
To be fair, Helen was a little less, oh, Pitcairn, you're looking so makey-outy tonight. I mean, she maybe was a little bit at the end, but, it's all kind of implied.
It's implied, and I wonder why it's implied, because she wants to thank Pitcairn properly. Properly? Okay.
With her lady parts? I don't know.
Please tell me they're going to arm wrestle, or maybe she packed him a lunch or something.
Yeah. Or here, I'm going to hand you a check. Here's some gas money, for want of better terminology.
Yeah. Or, hey, I will pay you to leave. It's kind of like what Richard Boone referred to as his increased pay on the final season of Have Gun Will Travel that he didn't really want to do, but they kept throwing truckloads of money at him. And finally he decided, you know what, this is go to hell money. This gives me enough in the bank that if someone approaches me with a part that's not worth my time, they go to hell.
Yeah.
So, a different definition of that, but maybe it's just like, great, I will pay you a large amount of money to leave and never come back.
Yeah. It's like, you're going to cause trouble for me. You need to get the hints.
The problem I have with this whole, I'm going to thank you properly. See, now you've got me doing that accent.
Sorry.
Because we've spent the whole episode acknowledging that Helen and Ritter are either an item or on the verge of being an item. So Pitcairn's just going to steal this dude's lady?
I guess. He's Gary Stu. He can't do anything wrong. Except, Ritter got lucky and landed a punch in his face.
It's the only way Ritter got lucky in this story.
Yeah, legit. Because even his lady's about to say, I got to go say goodbye to Pitcairn properly at the pool where I was extremely naked at one point. Let's put it there. Oh my gosh.
Poor Sam the horse has to be a witness to all this. Wilbur.
Oh my gosh, Wilbur. This is PG-13, Wilbur.
Yeah, Wilbur, this is not ready for prime time. Okay, Ashley, we have reached the end of our first adventure with Wrangler. What did you think?
When do we get back to Have Gun Will Travel? I appreciate the role in which this show plays in Gene's television history. It's important. And I have completionist tendencies, despite me telling everybody to not watch the finale of Enterprise. It would bother me if we skipped it. Let me put it that way. It would bother me if we skipped it, warts and all. I just know maybe this is Gene. He's trying to put together his first produced series. He's under a lot of pressure to make sure everything is running correctly and all of that. Is there maybe maybe less time devoted to the story, and so you've got a kind of paint by numbers sort of story? Did this air before Maggie O'Banion? I didn't check the dates on that.
I believe this aired after Maggie O'Banion by a good little bit, because Maggie O'Banion was in season 2 of Have Gun.
Yeah,
so
that's
that would have been late season 2, I think. So that would have been 58. This is a couple of years later.
Yeah.
Another thing I find myself wondering about, thinking back to all the stuff I said in trivia, this was a summer fill-in show for the Tennessee Ernie Ford show.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if everyone involved knew that. Like, we're here for a good time, but not for a long time.
Right.
We're only going to get 8 to 10 weeks of this. And then, as it turns out, because of the technological frontiers they were trying to push, they didn't even get that. We do know there were more scripts written for this show than there were filmed. And so I really kind of find myself wondering if, kind of going into this, everyone knew it was a dead show walking. And that can also do a whammy on your enthusiasm for something, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, that's a good point, Earl.
Whatever the cause, there's really very little here that screams Gene Roddenberry at me, other than the fact that we're obviously reworking Maggie O'Banion. And yet our visit with Maggie seemed much more nuanced and credible. Now, that started with Paladin getting his butt handed to him. You had Cookie commenting on everything and not being all that impressed by Paladin until he's trying to, show her some Paladin's kitchen tips, and you can read that however you like. And here it's just like Pitcairn just shows up and might as well be handing out a business card of his own. Pitcairn, professional badass. Has gun, is awesome at doing everything. Wire Paladin for a reference.
Mm-hmm.
What a guy.
Mm-hmm. What a guy. And he has really long conversations with his horse. Who doesn't like a guy that talks to animals?
I mean, that part of it, at least, is kind of fun. I would love to see this show get into a budget crunch, and the whole episode is just Pitcairn talking to his horse.
Right. Does the horse have a SAG card?
Yeah. I say that, I started out saying that in jest, but you know what? There are writers who could turn something like that and spin it into gold. In 1960, I don't think Gene is that writer just yet.
Mm.
And yet we have seen him turn in better work than this.
Yeah.
I asked myself, is this the genre? Because to some extent, the Western is a genre that's awash in testosterone.
Yeah.
And male power fantasies and other fantasies like being really good at everything. I'm the across-the-board hero and handyman of the hour, or half hour, in the case of this show's time slot. Our points of comparison for Gene writing Western so far have been some outstanding slices of Have Gun Will Travel, a few not-so-outstanding slices of Have Gun, an isolated specimen of Hotel de Paris, which I think we were both like, okay, let's see Gene write one more for this, and get even better at it. And, some boots and some saddles, which I think kind of left us, speaking only for myself, it left me a little nonplussed.
I was a little saddle sore. Had a few blisters from those boots.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a good laugh at how many times Gene's scripts have opened up with the gambit of Paladin getting mugged. But Paladin's fallibility keeps him interesting and keeps the show interesting. Pitcairn, at least in this pilot script, does not have these shades of fallibility. He's just showing up and demonstrating his awesomeness. It's not so much Paladin from Have Gun Will Travel. It's more like when Ash shows up in Army of Darkness.
Yes, this is my boomstick.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. You know, let me show you primitives how this is done.
Yeah.
The general outline of Pitcairn as a character is interesting. I'm up for the adventures of a well-read cowboy at large. I just hope that he gets more interesting than this in the scripts to come. And that brings us back to this, unfortunately, just when I was hoping that maybe the show itself came across better than just reading it on paper. We have this from the August 8th, 1960 TV scene column from the LA Times, again written by Cecil Smith, and I quote, "Despite the fact that it was the first outdoor show ever made on videotape, The Wrangler, the new Western that NBC offered last Thursday night, had little to recommend it. The tale was routine, the performances only adequate." Ouch.
Ooh.
Yeah, not the most promising start.
Yeah.
I am holding out hope that later installments of Wrangler wow us a lot more than this.
Yeah. You know, Earl, it's interesting. I never really thought about Westerns as being like a male power fantasy. But, you know, if you look at some of the dialogue, he says to Ritter, like, you and Helen are a lot alike. You both just need some breaking in. I'm like, oh my gosh. What do you mean? Like, we need to, you know, submit to your will just cause? Like, who's doing the breaking here? You know, and, you know, nowadays people would go haywire with that. They would read all kinds of stuff into that.
I was trying not to.
and so, like, when I was doing the recap, I was kind of careful to choose some of the way I express things, because frankly, nowadays people would read that with so much sexual overtones that, you know, it's missing the point of what the Western was actually doing. But it's all this language about exerting dominance and, you know, if you can tame an animal or break an animal, you can break anything else and everyone else. I think that's what really is so off-putting to me about this episode, is like, it's about Pitcairn being the boss and doing everything like a boss because he is a boss and he can break anything and anyone.
He's the man, and he's going to make sure everyone else knows he's the man. And that kind of brings me back to something that I read in the Kathleen Spencer book about Have Gun Will Travel, that the Western of this era of television was all about male primacy and male dominance, because men were now moving. You had war veterans who were now holding down office jobs and having to pay attention to the org chart, and they were no longer the man. And so the Western as a TV construct in this era of television was about giving these guys at home who had just worked an 8-hour day in the office, you know, hey, here's a little taste of what it was like to be the man. I do think the Western has evolved beyond that. In the modern age, I feel like the Western is now about kind of examining America's past and holding it somewhat accountable. So the Western is not always the same thing in the same age. It's not always male power fantasy, but here at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, oh yeah. It was about being the man, and at least according to that, you know, rather insightful part of that book, that I had never really thought of it this way, it was about leaving guys at home one last vestige of being the man. It's like, okay, you're not the man, but you get to watch this guy be the man on TV.
You too can live vicariously if you watch Wrangler. Tuesday nights, 7 p.m. NBC.
Yeah, it's really kind of sad if you think about it.
Yeah.
but I feel like there is a lot of truth in that. But even knowing that does not make this a better show, at least not this pilot installment. Like I said, as we have said in several cases in the past, like Hotel de Paris, there's more to this. I hope it gets better than this one installment. And fortunately, we will get to put that to the test one way or the other with Wrangler.
Yeah.
Saddle up. You've been listening to Mission Log Gene-ology. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory players. Our cast this week featured Cody Banning as Pitcairn and Brandon Stillwell as Pete. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on Facebook at missionlogpod. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. Patreon is your gateway to all things Mission Log, including exclusive access to the unedited version of our show, and our private Discord where you can interact with us, your hosts, during scheduled live chats, along with occasional screenings. You can access all this for just $1 a month, so head over to patreon.com/missionlog to see what tier works for you and join the conversation. By the way, reviews help our show more than you know. Even giving us a 5-star rating, if not a full written review, that will go a long way to tell the algorithm that you really like us and that other people might like us too. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com, and Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment.
On the next Gene-ology, A Time for Hanging. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.